Siege, a Shadow Invasion audiobook. Written by Savage Tempest.
Chapter 1. The abandoned hospital loomed over the street like a dark omen. The windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling, and the sign out front busted up. Just like the rest of LA. Maybe the world, thanks to the Helvari and their EMP attacks. Lazarus agents King, Nelson, and Miguel moved in a silent, controlled rhythm through the eerie halls of what used to be a bustling hospital. The smell of decay and mold clung to the air, making it difficult to breathe. They made their way through the hospital's ground floor, their footsteps silent except for the slight crunching due to glass and debris littering the floor. Once a sanitary haven, the place was now grime-infested and totally ransacked. King wouldn't have been surprised if they were the ones who did it. Medical supplies were now a very precious resource. Plus, Lazarus Project didn't care who or what they hurt. Only results mattered. And given the alien invasion, survival was pretty high on the list. Beating the aliens came next, which was why they were here. According to King's internal clock, it took them a good 10 minutes to make it through the empty rooms and hallways.
Ironic,
Miguel said, keeping his M16 rifle shoulder high.
What's ironic?
King took up the rear of their V formation.
A place that once healed the sick is now an alien hotel.
Nelson glared at them over her shoulder.
Shut it, Miguel. I plan on making you out of here alive. Besides, we don't know for sure if anyone's here.
King was tempted to point out that intel suggested otherwise. Instead, he followed Nelson and Miguel up a dark, crumbling stairwell. Not a problem when you're wearing night goggles. Though King knew that he really didn't need them thanks to his nanobots. Their mission was simple. Well, kinda. Gather intelligence on the Helvari's human collection sites. Collection site was a misnomer. The aliens used abandoned buildings to implant people with mind-controlling parasites. King and Miguel hurried up the steps as quietly as they could, still following Nelson's lead. The plan was your standard top-to-bottom search. But on the third floor, King noticed the stairwell door slightly ajar. He took a quick peek.
King, what are you doing?
King motioned for Nelson to be quiet and slowly pushed the door open. The corridor was dark, but the eerie blue glow in the room to the left was familiar. The aliens. Flipping his night vision goggles up, King crept forward, his rifle ready to toast to any alien stupid enough to try to jump him. The others followed close behind. As they got closer to the sinister blue light, they got a better look at the room. Hell. Which was a good way to describe the room. A medical center turned into a nightmare rendered in cold metal and dirt. Clumps of oily spheres hung on the walls and ceiling, giving the room its sickly blue light. Rows of rusted gurneys stretched into the grimy shadows, each one bearing a trapped human shadow. Thanks to his nanobots, King was all too well aware of the stench of human waste and smell. At a distance, most of them looked malnourished, like they hadn't eaten in days. All of them were dirty. Finger on his trigger, King stepped over the threshold and led Nelson and Miguel into this human hellscape. Miguel looked even more disgusted than King felt.
Why do they have these people here?
King shrugged.
Hook them up with parasites. Maybe experiment on them? Keep your voices down,
Nelson hissed as she started taking photos of the prisoners.
What are you doing?
Asked Miguel.
We gotta help these people.
Nelson continued taking pics.
Our mission is recon, not rescue. Hauser?
King didn't want to meet Miguel's accusing stare, so he focused on taking in as much of the room as possible. No signs of aliens, but knowing his luck, that wouldn't last long. The room wasn't much cleaner than the ground floor, so he doubted the Helvari did any procedures here. King tried not to look directly at the 24 or so people strapped down and gagged. Nelson was right. They weren't here to rescue civilians. They needed to gather as much intel as they could, then scram. Freeing these people might alert the Helvari, but it still didn't feel right. King's heart sank even further when he noticed a familiar face. Leonardo Rosenberg, celebrity artist. King turned to Miguel.
Free as many as you can, then we're out of here.
Nelson glared at King as if contemplating whether or not to shoot him.
We'll get out of here a lot faster if you help.
He didn't wait for Nelson to answer. He rushed over to Leonardo's gurney and ripped the straps away from him easily. Leonardo, his dark eyes haunted, pulled the gag from his mouth and sat up. He was skinnier than King remembered. Then again, that was months ago. Before the invasion.
King?
King put a finger to his mouth and shook his head. He pulled Leonardo to his feet.
Everybody, There's a stairwell to the left of this room. Stay quiet. There's an exit there.
Given the bad shape that these people were in, he wasn't sure how far they would get. Thankfully, he hadn't spotted any kids here. It took way too long to get everybody freed, so it was no surprise to King when they heard the howls.
Ammits,
said Miguel.
We need to leave now. I'll take point. Miguel, you have the rear.
Nelson gave Leonardo's shoulder a friendly squeeze.
You stay with King, okay?
Stunned, maybe shell-shocked, old Leo nodded. Nelson shot past Miguel and pushed her way through the wall of escapees. More howls. The Ammits would be here soon. Since the Ammits were like hairless werewolves, King knew that it would be a slaughter if the mutated humans caught them. Time to disappear. King grabbed Leonardo by the arm and ran for the stairwell. Practically dragging Leonardo, King rushed down the stairs. Howls echoed from the third-floor stairwell landing. No need to look up. The hunt was on, and he and these people were dinner. People started screaming when Miguel started laying down suppressive fire, but thankfully they didn't stop running down the steps. Some of these people were old. No way everyone was going to make it. If they lucked up, maybe Hayes and Naden would be near the exit. 2 Ammits launched themselves over the stairwell railing and landed on top of 2 people, crushing them. More panic ensued, naturally. King fired into the nearest Ammit's face, spattering brain goo all over everyone. The other Ammit was chowing down on one guy's throat, eliciting more screams from the freed prisoners as they trampled each other trying to escape down the stairwell. King let go of Leonardo and snatched the Ammit off the poor man, slamming it into the stairwell wall. The yelp it made reminded King that Ammits used to be human, but he could feel bad about that later. He needed to kill this thing fast before it took down anyone else. Ammits were incredibly strong and fast, but King's cybernetic limbs were stronger. King withdrew his Bowie knife and plunged it into the stunned Ammit's back. There was a burst of rapid fire from above, which meant Miguel was all right. King looked up just in time to see another damn Ammit leap over the rail. King pushed Leonardo into the wall just before the Ammit crashed into him, sending them both crashing down the staircase. The Ammit made it back to its feet before King. Snarling and baring its fangs, the Ammit launched itself at him. King pivoted to his left and hit the creature with a left hook, sending it over the railing, head first. More screams from below, then rifle fire. Nelson must have taken the Ammit out. Leonardo, still looking scared but no longer terrified, met King on the second-floor landing and handed him his rifle. Barrel first. Well, it's the thought that counts.
Miguel?
Miguel appeared seconds later. A little bruised but no missing limbs.
Right here.
A black woman came down the steps right behind him, her eyes going to King's left arm. That's when he noticed that his sleeve was pretty much shredded. No scars, of course. Not with his cybernetic limbs, which, thank God, looked like regular arms. More howls came from above.
Let's go.
Leonardo nodded. The 4 of them hurried down the dark staircase. The exit door was open when they reached the ground floor. Great. An alley, which left them really exposed.
Get down, King,
Nelson barked. King dropped to the ground, pulling Leonardo down with him. Miguel and the woman rolled to the right. 4 Ammits burst out of the door they just came through. A swarm of bullets ripped through their slick, oily bodies. The Ammits crumpled to the ground. Hayes and Naden came out of the shadows, looking all pleased with themselves.
Good job,
Nelson told them, then spun around and strode over to King, and she looked really pissed.
If you 2 are done playing hero, we need to get back to HQ.
Miguel swept his hand toward the civilians.
We can't just leave them here.
Nelson glanced over at Leonardo.
Rosenberg can come with us. Everyone else?
She shook her head. Ammit howls pierced the night. The people they just rescued were shaking and whimpering. Only 20 or so still alive now. King reached for the coldness in his heart but couldn't find it.
Hayes, you and Naden take our 6.
Nelson spared King a look.
King, you and Miguel are on 12. I've got 3 o'clock.
Despite her total indifference toward the people they just saved, King had to admit that Nelson made a great team leader. Bonus points. Her ass looked great even in camo pants. King tensed up as the Ammits continued to howl. They were circling them in. They could make it out easily, if they left the civilians behind. King shook the idea from his head as Nelson raised her M16 and addressed the escapees.
My team and I will take care of these monsters. You can help by staying quiet and not running off when things get hot.
And on cue, one of the former captives, a man in his mid-20s, took off like a dart. He didn't make it 60 feet before a blur bowled into him. One scream, and it was over. Nelson turned to the rest of the escapees.
Anyone else?
Shaking terrified faces all around. Miguel and King took up their positions a good 15 feet from the people they needed to protect, and King was determined to protect them. Movement to their left. King slid his night vision goggles down into place. Yeah, the nanobots in his body made his night vision pretty good, but night vision goggles made images pop, and that's what he planned to do. Pop these Amets with bullets.
I've got movement on my left,
Shouted Hayes.
Don't fire until they're at least 20 feet in,
Said Nelson.
Make that 30,
Said King, sounding more confident than he felt.
Amets move really, really fast. Shoot at 30.
In a lower voice, Nelson added,
Don't counter my order again, King.
Nothing but the moon and a city block's worth of alleys stood between them and an Amet attack, which was inevitable. King planned on taking as many of them down with his rifle as possible. If he had to use his fists, that meant the Amets were close enough to attack the people they were protecting. King smelled the Amets before he saw them. Unwashed dog wouldn't be exactly too far off, but unwashed wolf would be closer to the truth. Amets started piling out of the alleyway's shadows, barking and snarling. Through his night vision goggles, the creatures looked like radiation-green werewolves, minus the fur. Drool spilled out of their mouths as the Amets charged at them from the front, back, and King's right. Miguel glanced at King and nodded. Good man. He was ready for this fight, and King had no doubt that this was going to be a damn good one. A pack of Amets on all fours bore down on their position, and that was just from his and Miguel's side. King fired, joined by Miguel. The others were firing their rifles too. A hint of sulfur and blood permeated the air as King lit the Amets up. Crap. Some of them were getting through. Screaming from behind him confirmed that. Yeah, Amets were more beast than human, but they apparently had enough sense to spread themselves out. One Amet got past King and bit down on his wrist. Mistake. That allowed King to hit the thing in its left ear, causing it to stumble backward. King aimed his M16 at its chest and let loose. The thing was a bleeding corpse in seconds.
There are too many of them,
Shouted Miguel. Before King could get back into position, an Amet soared over his head and landed on top of Leonardo. If King didn't act fast, Leonardo was toast. King grabbed the snarling Amet from behind and flung him over his shoulder into an oncoming Amet. Miguel was busy popping off as many Amets as he could, which meant that King needed to move fast. Another Amet leaped high in the air, planning to jump past them and get to the group of escapees. King spun around and managed a sucker punch to the creature's head just as it landed. The escapees screamed and backed up into each other. King ignored them and Leonardo, and plowed his cybernetic fist into the fallen Amet's face, crushing its snout and a good portion of its skull. A hungry snarl was the only warning King got. Before he could straighten up, Nelson blasted the Amet bearing down on him, dropping it mid-run.
Thanks.
Nelson nodded, then took up her defensive position once again. Not easy with a bunch of civilians clustered around you. Almost as bad. It was starting to sound like a war zone. If they didn't get out of here soon, parasites were going to join the party. A whistle pierced the night. King dared to look around to see who would be stupid enough to do such a thing. Drawing the attention of an Amet was damn well suicidal. A tall guy, maybe 2 inches taller than King, sauntered up behind the Amets, whistling of all things. Pale, lightly muscled, and his white hair a little too long, he was dressed like some cyberpunk dude, fancy leather jacket and all. The Amet smelled him and scrambled toward the stranger. King couldn't believe what happened next. Cyberpunk dude knelt down and spread his hand face down on the alleyway asphalt. King almost forgot to start firing again as he watched Cyberpunk dude's ghost white skin literally turn charcoal gray, looking exactly like the asphalt beneath him. 3 Amets piled onto Cyberpunk dude, snarling and slashing with their claws. Seconds later, Cyberpunk dude's fist burst through one Amet's back. The other 2, he had by their throats. He smashed them together, eliciting strangled cries from the creatures. More Amets came out of the shadows and attacked. Didn't matter. Cyberpunk dude was like a phantom, moving with startling speed and grace. He kneed an Amet in the snout before it could get back to its feet, then shoved its lunging buddy so hard it sent the Amet stumbling into another Amet. Cyberpunk dude's attacks were so fast and brutal, King wondered if he was using Krav Maga, which was far deadlier than his own kickboxing training. Cyberpunk dude also had super strength, almost like he was asphalt personified. 4 more Amets fell to him in seconds. Blood splattered everywhere. King couldn't believe it. The Amets were rushing back into the shadows. King stared at Cyberpunk dude as his skin turned normal again.
Who are you?
Sweat dripped from Nelson's face.
Someone who wants the Alvari dead.
He pointed at King.
You need a new augment.
Cyberpunk dude winked at Nelson, turned around and left.
Should we stop him?
Asked Hayes. Nelson shook her head.
We've got enough to worry about.
King knew she was right. He looked around at the blood and bodies staining the ground. 5 dead. Damn. They started off with 24, and now they were down to 14 people. Some heroes they were turning out to be. Chapter 2. Post-alien invasion, Lazarus Project headquarters was now an underground haven instead of being a mere covert ops cell. King wasn't certain how many Lazarus cells existed around the country, or if they truly existed. A year ago, King never would have thought he'd be grateful for an underground base carved beneath downtown LA's subway. The room they were crammed into smelled almost as bad as the area where they had freed the captives. With 15-plus bodies now jostling for space, it felt uncomfortably crowded. The 14 surviving escapees wore the haunted look of those who had seen the unthinkable. Their eyes darted nervously under the harsh glare of the LED lights, their bodies tense and primed for the next threat. King, Miguel, and the other agents shed their tactical gear and dumped the equipment into a super-large black container, along with their weapons. The quarantine room, with its weathered concrete walls and low-hanging ceiling, got even more crowded when 2 armed agents marched into the room, their presence akin to a vice squeezing the air out of the room. 2 technicians with technobabble equipment followed in their footsteps. All 4 of them wore hazmat suits. Nelson and Miguel quickly started unbuttoning their camo tops. Hayes and Nadan were already shirtless. King yanked his top off, deliberately keeping his back to the escapees, especially Leonardo. He wasn't ready to face the guy. After the first tech finished checking Nadan's back for hitchhikers, he moved on to King, running some kind of scanner that supposedly detects the parasite, even in its larva stage. After a couple of beeps from his scan, the technician moved on to the woman who had stayed near Miguel during their trek back to headquarters. King thought he overheard her say that her name was Kelly. Medium brown skin, average boobs. King wondered if Miguel was attracted to her. He had never known his friend to date black women. King thought Miguel preferred Asian females. He had to admit, he and Kelly kinda looked good together, which for some reason annoyed him. Kelly didn't want to remove her blouse, but after Miguel explained that they had to check for parasites, she begrudgingly complied. Apparently she was a nurse or something.
Olivia, what's going on?
Leonardo was several people behind King.
Where are we? We're safe,
said Nelson, sounding kinder than she had all evening.
Sorry. You have to trust me, Leo. We're the good guys.
And on cue, enter Wilson, Lazarus Project's sociopathic mastermind and director, dressed up in another one of his designer suits. Figures. Here Earth was in the middle of an alien invasion and Wilson was still sporting designer suits. Wilson swept everyone up in one evil blue glare. His eyes narrowed on the escapees and his nose crinkled in disgust. Wilson turned to Nelson.
I thought you were smarter than bringing home strays.
To her credit, Nelson didn't flinch.
We busted them out of the hospital before the Helvari implanted them with parasites. Then we were attacked by Amids,
added Hayes.
Yet you folks made it back with all your limbs intact.
Wilson aimed his sneer at King.
Well, at least some of you.
Bastard. Wilson knew full well that King still felt bitter about having his arms cut off by the aliens. Well, at least he wasn't verbally assaulting the escapees. Nelson and he could take the verbal abuse. These poor people, well, they've been through enough. Wilson's evil blue eyes lit up as if he was reading King's thoughts. He spun around and regarded the escapees with disdain.
Just great.
Wilson frowned in disgust.
More mouths to feed. I suppose we can always use more janitors. Do any of you have any useful skills?
The escapees looked uncomfortable, some of them still being examined by the med techs. Kelly eventually spoke up.
I'm a doctor.
Wilson stared her down. Kelly was the first to blink.
An intern, actually. Wonderful.
Wilson dismissed Kelly with his eyes, instead targeting Miguel.
After she's processed, take her over to Doc Stevens. Lord knows he needs to get laid.
Kelly's eyes grew wide with panic, and Miguel flushed with anger.
He's joking. Well, he's not funny.
A new layer of tension filled the small room. King checked the 2 agents by the door. They weren't reacting, but King felt sure they would if Wilson gave the order. Wilson looked over at Nelson, then back at King.
Is that celebrity artiste Leonardo Rosenberg back there?
To Leo's credit, he returned Wilson's condescending gaze with one of his own.
Have we met? My luck held out until today.
He was talking to Leo, but his eyes remained on King.
Rosenberg, you can bunk with King and Miguel.
Wilson smiled innocently.
I'm sure you'll have lots to talk about.
Yeah, like how he and Nelson slept with Leo just to get him to sell them 2 of his exclusive paintings. At the mission briefing, Wilson claimed he wanted the paintings to strike back at Lazarus Project's supposed enemy, the Crimson Syndicate. Instead, all they wound up doing was devaluing Leo's paintings and destroying his career. Yeah, lots to talk about. A loud beep cut through King's dark thoughts.
Got a positive over here,
said one of the medtechs. One of their charges, a thin teenager, broke for the weapons bin. A parade of bullets made him dance like a puppet before he went down. The escapees screamed.
Shut them up,
hissed Wilson. Nelson took charge.
It's okay. He was tainted.
Wilson stopped focusing on Nelson's ass and smiled at King, sighing.
Oh well. Guess we have one less mouth to feed.
Chapter 3. King removed his toiletry kit from his locker, and Miguel did the same. Their tiny quarters made King's slumlord apartment look like a duplex. Bunk beds were grafted to the wall on both sides of the room, 2 chairs and a table. That was pretty much the extent of their luxurious living quarters at Lazarus, except for the little speaker on Miguel's bed that was playing some kind of dance electronic music. Things would get worse once Leonardo moved in. A lot worse. King was definitely not looking forward to that conversation. With less than 300 agents, they had enough room not to triple up. Wilson just wanted to stir up trouble. He enjoyed making King squirm. Actually, the Lazarus director enjoyed making everybody squirm. Christ, 300 agents. How were they supposed to save the world against an army of aliens? King didn't know if the Helvari came with an army, but it probably didn't matter. The aliens certainly had the technological advantage. Plus, with the blackout knocking out power worldwide, it wasn't looking good. If it weren't for Lazarus fusion generators, well, they would be screwed like everyone else.
What are we listening to?
Asked King.
Progressive house band from Latavia. Where's Latavia? Somewhere in the Baltics.
King removed a towel from his locker and shut it.
It's not bad. How did you get that thing to work? Cooper in the tech department hooked me up.
Miguel grabbed his towel and looked at King. For a second or two, his eyes were almost the color of Wilson's.
What are we going to do, Hauser? About what? The invasion. If Lazarus Project is all Earth's got against the aliens, we're totally screwed.
King shook his head. He'd been wondering the same thing.
I don't know. We'll figure something out. We always do. Yeah, well, that's before the aliens entered the picture and start sticking people with parasites. How are we supposed to fight them? The parasites? They're still human. Not anymore.
Miguel had a good heart, but sometimes the guy was so impractical.
So you'll just kill them if Wilson says to?
King took a deep breath before answering.
If it's us or them, absolutely.
Disappointment in his eyes, Miguel shook his head as if he couldn't believe what King just said. Miguel's next question caught him off guard, even though it shouldn't have.
So, why didn't you tell me about Nelson?
King sighed.
It was only once. Usually you can't wait to brag about your one-night stands. Usually they're not my supervisor.
Miguel nodded.
What about our new roommate? Rosenberg? He's not your supervisor.
Well, it's not like he didn't know this particular conversation wasn't inevitable. King put on airs anyway.
What are you saying? Nothing. I just didn't know that Rosenberg was your type. You're making a big deal out of nothing. I only slept with Rosenberg for the mission. Really?
Miguel's eyes turned hard.
Since when did you jump like a monkey when Wilson snaps his fingers? Watch it. Or what? You'll beat me down with those cybernetic fists of yours?
King unclenched his jaw and glared at Miguel. Before he could defend himself, Nelson barged into the room.
Try knocking sometime.
Nelson didn't flinch as she sauntered into the room.
Perhaps I wanted to catch you both naked.
She noticed Miguel's scowl.
Just kidding, Miguel. Lighten up. I could hear you guys arguing halfway down the hall.
That was an exaggeration, but King felt pretty sure that Miguel got Nelson's point. She made a show of looking at their toiletry kits and offered them both a conciliatory smile.
I see you're headed for the shower. I need to speak to Agent King for a few minutes if you don't mind. Not at all.
Miguel kicked his locker closed with the back of his foot.
Just don't use my bed when you're talking.
They both watched Miguel snatch up his music device and head out the door. King didn't exactly know how he felt about Nelson staring at Miguel's ass as he left. She followed his wake and shut the door. When she came back over to him, King noted the tension lines on her forehead. She looked tired and pissed. King tried to keep his eyes off her chest, which wasn't easy given how tonight's sweat caused her standard-issue t-shirt to cling to her skin.
Okay, let me have it.
Nelson's dark eyes flashed for a moment before she reined in her temper. Her voice was silky when she started.
Is it because I'm a woman?
An open-ended question landmine.
Is what because you're a woman?
Nelson folded her arms and tried to look sympathetic.
Plenty of guys can't stand having a woman outrank them. This isn't the military. That's right. Our military had their butts handed to them by the aliens, which makes it even more important that we maintain discipline and follow orders.
King knew Nelson was right and wrong. Lazarus Project was a highly weaponized covert ops arm of the U.S. government. At least, that's what Wilson told him when he first joined. Now, King would bet money that Lazarus was closer to a private army, one with its own research and development facilities, an agenda. Well, at least before the invasion.
What if it were your technician friend held prisoner by the Helvari? That's low, King. Trisha is dead, but at least she was one of us. Yeah? So what's Leo? Just someone you fucked? We fucked, King. Stop acting like you didn't enjoy it. Or are you sorry it wasn't Miguel? Leave Miguel out of this.
Hell, this discussion had devolved from a chewing out to a lover's spat. Not that they were lovers.
We tanked Leo's career. Saving him is the least we could do. Hayes and Naden got wounded thanks to your crazy stunt. Yeah, and 13 civilians were saved. Maybe more.
Nelson glared at him.
Okay, maybe not.
King's already tiny quarters felt even smaller, heightened by the fact that he and Nelson were coiled in a stalemate of sorts. Under the room's LED lights, Nelson's eyes glowed like two dark embers, smoldering with a mix of frustration and reluctant respect. But he was still pissed at her for accusing him of wanting to sleep with Miguel. He didn't. Yeah, he had screwed up a lot of things in his life, but he sure as hell wasn't going to screw up his friendship with his best buddy.
All right, I'll follow orders from now on. But are you sure this isn't about Wilson?
Nelson gave King one of her death stares. Then her features softened.
You don't want to believe that Wilson is an alien? Fine. I'll expose him on my own. He's not the Helvari. How would you know?
King shrugged.
The Helvari don't smell. Kind of like lizards don't. Lizards do emit scents.
Nelson shot back.
Yeah, when they're trying to mate or something.
Nelson shook her head.
You're missing the point, King. Wilson's not human. We can't trust him.
Wilson would have them executed if he heard them talking like this, or at least try to. For a brief, panicked moment, King wondered if they should have checked for bugs before they started this conversation. Nelson saw the worry in his eyes.
A bit late to be thinking about bugs, don't you think? Stop worrying, King. Since the blackout, Lazarus doesn't have the resources or manpower to eavesdrop on every HQ room.
Suggesting that Nelson knew for a fact that there were certain places in HQ where conversations were being recorded. According to Lazarus's tech heads, the entire planet had been affected by the blackout. The aliens' EMP attacks had left them in a world of hurt, and now parasites had been added to the mix. No wonder the U.S. military couldn't come up with effective countermeasures to fight the aliens. King shook his head.
Even if I did believe your story about Wilson being an alien, which I don't, I certainly don't believe that Miguel's one too. What if I show you the blood work?
She really wasn't going to let this go.
Don't you get it, Olivia? Alien or not, Wilson is Lazarus. And Lazarus is the only game in town. Or haven't you noticed? The world's gone to hell. So what do you suggest? We simply close our eyes and pretend Wilson's human?
King moved closer.
Well, we've done the arguing a bit.
King shifted his eyes to his bed.
How about we do the making up part?
Nelson frowned at him.
Does that line ever work on anyone? Not as much as I would like. We have aliens in our midst, and sex is what's occupying your small mind? The end of the world is the perfect time to think about sex. Someone's got to repopulate the world.
Nelson's wristband pulsed yellow.
I need to go and brief Wilson. Think about what I said.
King nodded, then fixed Nelson with what he hoped was a smooth smile.
You going to tell him about that cyberpunk dude? I don't know, King. I really don't know.
Chapter 4. 6 hours wasn't much sleep time, but thanks to the nanites in his system and the fact that Leonardo didn't show up until King was way past asleep, King couldn't complain. Much. Miguel was still pissed at him. Even headed out for breakfast without barely saying anything to him. Talk about overreacting. So what? He didn't tell him that he screwed Nelson and Leo. Hardly reason enough for Miguel to ignore him and sit next to someone else during the briefing. King suspected that Nelson might still be mad at him too, but at least she didn't ignore him out of existence when their eyes met. She didn't even sit next to that idiot Maddox. He didn't think the gorilla was her type, especially after how Nelson went on about how she didn't like dumb guys. But hey, you never know. The briefing room was tiered like a college lecture hall, packed with neat rows of attached seats and little fold-down desks. A whiteboard and compact slide projector made up most of the tiny front platform. The room held 40 agents comfortably, and right up front stood the teacher from hell, Lazarus Project Director Wilson.
All right,
said Wilson.
Settle down, people. We have a lot to accomplish today.
By we, Wilson meant Lazarus agents had a lot of work ahead. King seriously doubted that Wilson did much work aside from flipping through his supervillain handbook and pose in front of the mirror to see if his tie was straight.
Agent Garrison,
continued Wilson,
will start us off.
Wilson gestured for the Lazarus psychologist to join him on the platform as he moved to the side.
I'll do my best to make this as succinct as possible.
Garrison, like Wilson, was dressed in a suit. Unlike the first time he met her, Agent Garrison wore no makeup except for subdued red lipstick.
According to verified intel, the Helvari are bipedal creatures not unlike ourselves.
Garrison shook a finger at the person in the control room behind them. The projector turned on, displaying a dead Helvari with an object sticking out of its chest. King figured that Maddox had taken the photo before they managed to flee the spaceship. The alien's reptilian face was sharp and narrow, and looked like he suffered from a bad rash.
The Helvari,
continued Garrison,
also appear to possess psionic abilities to allow them to make us see things that aren't really there.
Several agents verbally scoffed at the idea. Garrison nodded as if she could relate to their skepticism.
Several of your colleagues have been subjected to the alien's power of the mind. Isn't that right, Agent Maddox?
People turned in their seats to look at Maddox. After a few moments, Maddox spoke up.
Yeah, they can mess with your mind.
Mini debates immediately sprung up, but Wilson silenced them with a hand, and Garrison continued her briefing.
We believe the Helvari are controlling the parasites.
Garrison moved through the slideshow like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, each grisly image of the parasites, carefully dissected and discussed. In the parasite's larva stage, it was luminescent green to the point of almost glowing, and about the size of a quarter, fleshy and gelatin at the same time. King shuddered, remembering how that thing was inside of him weeks ago before the third wave began. When they removed it from him, Lazarus didn't know quite what it was. The parasite infection didn't happen until the third wave, though they did guess correctly that the parasite is also a tracking device. Organic, if you can believe that. Why do we call them Helvari? Asked one agent.
Good question.
Wilson's predatory eyes targeted King.
Agent King?
King almost shuddered again, but for a different reason this time. He didn't like being the center of attention. Too much attention at Lazarus Project was a bad thing.
I overheard them when I was abducted. The second time. In his mind, folks,
added Wilson, tapping his head. A barrage of questions echoed through the room. Wilson, ever impatient, signaled for Doc Stevens. The doctor's eyes widened slightly, then he cleared his throat as he exchanged his seat for the slightly raised platform. Garrison moved to the right, giving Doc Stevens center stage. Doc Stevens had dual licenses, biology and a clinical laboratory scientist license. Doc Stevens launched into an explanation about the parasites and the symptoms of people infested with them. The slide he currently displayed, something straight out of a horror movie, showed the disgusting parasite worming its tendrils into a human's central nervous system. King swallowed hard, the taste of bile clinging stubbornly to the back of his throat.
Is there a cure for the parasites?
Asked one agent.
Yes.
A smirk appeared on Wilson's lips.
A bullet to the head.
No one laughed. Garrison spoke up to smooth things over.
As some of you may have heard, we had an incident last night.
King felt certain that news of one of the people his team brought back to HQ was tainted and executed.
One of the Tainted was brought back to headquarters, which only emphasizes how important it is not to bring people here. What about family?
Hayes asked.
We are your family,
said Wilson, his posture daring anyone to argue the point.
You and everyone here should have been briefed on Lazarus sending out rescue squads every third day to locate family members. The U.S. military also appears to be implementing a search and rescue operation.
Yeah, and everyone here should also know that the third wave devastated the military's ranks. A lot of people were tainted, and the Marines and every other kind of soldier were no different. The alien invasion came in 3 waves, each one nastier than the last. The first wave, Abductions. He was one of the unlucky ones. They cut off his arms, then replaced them with cybernetic limbs. Wave 2 hit Earth hard. The Helvari unleashed EMP attacks that plunged entire cities into darkness. Food shortages. Crime became the norm. Panic in the streets. The third wave. Now that was the real kicker. The Helvari gave them the Tainted.
You,
Wilson said to Hayes,
and anyone here is free to leave and go hunt for family members. Just don't expect to be welcomed back. So,
asked another agent,
can someone be saved once they've been infected?
Wilson frowned, but Doc Stevens answered anyway.
Yes, it's possible, particularly in the parasite's larva stage, which is in the boring.
Wilson kept his eyes on the seated agents.
Get to the point, Doc.
Doc Stevens' face flushed bright red. He did, thankfully, get to the point. It was possible to remove the parasite safely from its host as long as the creature hadn't matured to the point where it had its hooks into the victim's spinal cord. Garrison changed the slide, showing a crowd of infected people attacking, biting, beating.
The parasites basically turn people into zombies. Not the kind that eat brains. Just empty human shells doing the Helvari's bidding, which, at present, seems to be taking down our military, along with other militaries around the world.
Man, this presentation gave new meaning to death by PowerPoint. Next, Wilson introduced someone that could have been his older brother. Similar high-end suit and same creepy radiation blue eyes.
Trevor Hunt here,
said Wilson, gesturing to the man,
is part of the Lazarus Northern California cell. He'll be acting as liaison. Any questions for Mr. Hunt?
Yeah.
Maddox blurted out.
You steal that suit from Wilson's closet?
This won Mr. Not Funny a few laughs from their fellow agents. Wilson graced Maddox with an evil glare before turning to Trevor Hunt. King realized that it was a good chance that they were not, in fact, related. Yes, they both shared the same predatory blue eyes and condescending airs, but otherwise, they looked totally different. Hunt's angular, chiseled features made him look more like a fading movie star. Wilson's face was wider, his build stockier, though probably mostly muscle.
You have to forgive the meat,
Wilson said with a smile.
Good cannon fodder is hard to find.
Maddox stopped laughing. Trevor Hunt smiled, reminding King of their sociopathic director.
The NorCal cell and several other cells worldwide have observed the aliens using some pretty nifty portal technology. We're not exactly sure what these portals are or how they're created, but we're reasonably certain that the Helvari use them as a means of instant transportation.
Portals? Great. Blackouts, and now portals. King found it kind of hard to believe. Judging by the looks on some of the faces around him, he wasn't the only one skeptical of this supposed alien tech. Without being too obvious, he hoped, King glanced over at Miguel on the other side of the room. Yep, Miguel was eating this stuff up. If this Hunt character was right about the portals, that could be the final nail in the coffin for Earth.
Our objective,
continued Hunt,
is to get inside at least one portal and detonate some EMPs.
As Hunt declared the objective, his gaze pinned King, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. For one awful moment, King felt like Hunt could read his soul. Now who would take on such a mission? Exploding even one electromagnetic bomb would be sheer suicide for the bomber. King snuck a peek to his far left. Nelson was doing a great job of maintaining a neutral face, but he seriously doubted that she would be volunteering for any suicidal missions anytime soon. King hoped that Miguel wouldn't be gung-ho enough to volunteer, but he couldn't be sure. Actually, King wasn't sure of much lately, except that the aliens were very bad for humanity, and that Lazarus Project could not be trusted. Hunt outlined the rules of engagement for those eventually selected to be part of his team. King found himself staring at the man, then at a smirking Wilson. Could they be aliens too? He quickly killed that thought. Nelson was making him paranoid. Wilson might be an evil sociopath, but an alien. King remembered how the Helvari made him think that Wilson was on the alien ship with him, Miguel, and Maddox. Until King blasted him in the face. Mental voodoo powers were a real thing. Why not portals?
I'll have more later for the team leaders,
said Hunt, stepping off the mini platform.
They will pass the information on to you.
Hunt's eyes targeted King a second time.
Thank you for your attention. Rules of engagement?
Asked Nelson. Wilson looked at Nelson, or rather he looked at her boobies before answering.
Fantastic question, Agent Nelson. All agents are to put an alien or tainted down. It's us or them. By the way, unless otherwise signed off by me or Hunt, no one leaves headquarters without being in a team of at least 3 people.
Wilson's eyes darted in Hunt's direction, making King wonder if Hunt held a higher position in Lazarus than Wilson.
And just as importantly, no man or woman is to be left behind, no matter what.
Nelson spoke up.
Things get pretty rough out there sometimes. Those are your orders, Agent Nelson.
Wilson offered her a plastic smile. This all sounded a little too humane for the Lazarus director. King waited for the other shoe to drop. Wilson snapped his fingers and Doc Stevens removed a red metal canister from his lab coat pocket, then passed it over to Wilson. Wilson showed off the canister like he was filming a TV commercial.
We call this pyro cream. Instant cremation in a can. Just toss it onto your dead buddy's body and watch it burn to ashes in seconds, scrambling your battle buddy's DNA with a fresh lemony scent.
No one said anything, not even Garrison. This was callous, even for Wilson. King wondered why Lazarus Project wanted to cremate agents on the field. It's not like the Helvari didn't know all about human physiology anyway.
That's pretty cold, Wilson,
Maddox grumbled.
That's war, Agent Maddox.
Garrison's tone was uncharacteristically harsh. They were dismissed soon after Wilson's little announcement. Agents began filtering out of the room. Nelson and some other team leaders remained seated. Before King could make it out of the room unscathed, Wilson beckoned him over with a finger. Hunt watched him comply with those predatory blue eyes of his.
You all right, Howie?
Asked Wilson.
You've been unusually quiet.
Wilson looked meaningfully at Miguel shuffling out.
Trouble in Lover's Paradise?
We're friends.
Sure you are. Next you'll be telling me that you don't swallow.
You want my cybernetic fist in your mouth?
Wilson raised his hands in feigned surrender.
Not my kink.
King's peripheral vision told him that Trevor Hunt was enjoying this exchange. Guess he was a sadistic pig just like Wilson.
What do you want?
King asked.
I need a favor, Howie.
What?
Don't bring home any more strays.
Wilson gave King his back and took the stage once again. King left, the images from the slides and thoughts of alien portals haunting his steps. He had his orders. Now it was just a matter of surviving them. Chapter 5. Bullets ripped into the wall as King ran for cover. The Tainted weren't textbook zombies. They were worse. People infected with parasites, though mindless, had no problem fighting and running and firing automatic weapons when they got their hands on them. King threw himself behind the sanctuary of the grocery storefront, a hail of bullets following him. Hayes returned fire in the direction of King's pursuers as King joined him. They were too exposed, and it wouldn't be long before the Tainted started flanking them from the opposite side. It was so creepy, all those people rushing toward them, not really making a sound until they got blasted by rifle fire.
Come on.
King waved at the rest of the team to join them.
Move.
Shut up.
barked Hayes.
Get that door open or we're dead.
King didn't like Hayes' tone, but the man did have a point. King turned toward the door, wondering what would be the best way to get through the door. He tried grabbing it from both sides, but it was awkward as hell. He hadn't fully gotten the hang of his cybernetic hands. Hitting people was easy. Finesse. He could still use some work. With his nanobot hearing, King heard 3 sets of boots running in their direction. Seconds later, Nelson, Blake, and Miguel were crowding the store's facade. They started firing immediately. King felt Miguel's stupid back scabbard poking him slightly in his lower spine, making him wonder once again why Nelson let Miguel bring it along.
Why isn't that door open, King?
Nelson's voice sounded strained.
I'm trying not to break it so we can use it as a barricade.
Doesn't matter,
said Miguel.
Think that guy has a bazooka.
That distracted King for a moment.
A what? A shoulder rocket launcher,
added Blake, her voice as tense as everyone else's. Well, that meant the door was toast anyway. No point in holding back. King cocked his right fist back, then punched a hole through the metal door. That gave him all the leverage he needed. He sucked one hand into the hold and ripped the door off its hinges.
Everyone, inside.
Nelson continued firing at the Tainted, who were now headed their way. It was like a goddamn human river. Tainted River, that is.
You too, King.
King tossed the metal door at the wave of Tainted, knocking several of them down. Their brethren trampled over them. King wondered how they had found them. Could the Tainted smell normal humans? Or was Garrison right that they were being controlled by the aliens?
I said, get inside.
Nelson ran past him into the grocery store. King followed, noting that the fluorescent ceiling lights were on. Store probably had a backup generator or something. The grocery store was a graveyard of toppled shelves and scattered merchandise, a horrible reminder of the world they lost. King was barely 10 feet inside when he heard the screech of a missile. Blake shouted for them to take cover. The storefront they had just abandoned went up in flames, completely obliterated. Nelson took a moment to switch out magazines.
We have to find the stairs and get to the roof.
No,
said King, checking to see if his M16 needed reloading.
That would only trap us. High ground is always tactically better,
said Miguel, withdrawing his sword from his back scabbard. This was the first time King got a good look at Miguel's sword. The blade was shiny, probably sharp as hell, with a fancy handle that screamed museum piece. The sound of the Tainted climbing through the entrance debris got them all running in the opposite direction, adrenaline and fear driving them. They sprinted for the back of the grocery store. Shattering glass on their left slowed them down. Great, more Tainted, some of them easily vaulting past the newly broken window. This forced King and his team to split their fire on 2 fronts. Thanks to his enhanced hearing, their rifles sounded like he was walking through exploding landmines. King didn't have time to gawk, but damn if Miguel didn't make it hard. Even as he unloaded round after round from his automatic into the horde chasing them, King's gaze kept finding its way back to Miguel. His buddy moved through the looted store like some kind of Grim Reaper ballet dancer, totally out of place among the ransacked shelves. King barely dodged a grasping hand, the sour smell of unwashed flesh filling his nostrils. His attacker looked early 30s. King smashed his face with a sloppy elbow strike. Nelson and Blake were holding their own, blasting Tainted as they hoofed it toward the back. Miguel, though, he was fluid, almost predatory, the sword in him lopping off heads with ease. Every swing was an execution, every dodge a lifesaver. King shook his head and grinned despite himself, then plunged back into the fight. The gunfire and the grunts of exertion from Nelson, Hayes, and Blake echoing in his ears. In the madness, he watched Hayes take down another Tainted. Hayes was a big guy, muscles built for this kind of work, his shots steady and deadly. But then, from the corner of King's eye, he saw someone leap from a nearby shelf. Hayes saw him too late and went down hard with 2 Tainted now climbing on top of him. His automatic skidded out of reach. King started to go back for him, but Miguel and Blake shoved him forward. Hayes' screams were cut short. King's last image of the agent was of the Tainted sinking their teeth into Hayes' throat and leg. Hell, since when did the Tainted start eating flesh? King gritted his teeth and forced his stomach to settle down, feeling guilty for leaving a man behind, hating himself for feeling guilty. They burst through the wooden doors into what must be the stockroom. The Tainted were seconds behind. Firing behind you while you run forward was stupid and awkward as hell. But King was desperate and pulling up the rear. No way he was going to let the Tainted take another one of them down. He was wrong, of course, and they were dead. They were just too stubborn to accept the fact.
The stairs.
Nelson pointed and ran toward the staircase, the rest of them close behind. King still felt that going upstairs was a bad idea, but in for an inch. King took up the rear, keeping his finger on the trigger. Wet thumps of tainted flesh hit the bottom landing only to be trampled on by more tainted. His modified hand didn't tire, the recoil barely registering, as his cybernetic appendage did its job with ruthless efficiency. The tainted reacted like everyone else did when they were on the wrong side of a bullet. Dead. After what they had done to Hayes, King didn't care. Still, that didn't slow the tainted down much. What used to be regular people, these guys mindlessly threw themselves into King's storm of bullets, their vacant eyes devoid of fear and caution. They were nothing but flesh and instinct now, driven by God knows what. Unlike King and his team, the tainted had no sense of self-preservation or worries about their cybernetic arms being the only thing left of their chewed-up bodies. King and the others pounded up the stairs. This building was only 3 stories high. No way the roof was going to be a good place to make a last stand. A wave of tainted followed them up the stairs, their eyes clear yet soulless.
Watch out!
Miguel shouted. Miguel's warning barely registered before a pair of tainted hands clawed at King's legs. Miguel's blade was a blur of silver and made quick work of King's attackers. Their heads suddenly separated from their bodies.
Thanks, man.
King managed, but his gratitude was cut short by a white pain exploding in his back. Someone had shot him. Spinning around, he saw the shooter. Before King could react, the tainted's next shot took Miguel down. Confusion marred Miguel's eyes as he slid down, leaving a trail of blood and brain matter on the wall. King's cry of grief choked in his throat. His retaliation was swift, a tempest of bullets that brought death to tainted after tainted, starting with the fucker who had killed Miguel, his best buddy. More than a buddy. Body after body went down as King kept firing. He felt a hand on his shoulder but shrugged it off.
He's gone, King.
Nelson wiped the tears from her face.
Now get your head back in the game.
Nelson shot 2 oncoming tainted, emphasizing her point. With a heavy heart and a heavier trigger finger, King ascended the stairs behind Nelson and Blake, leaving a trail of fallen tainted bodies behind. Blake's panicked shout announced another obstacle, a locked door standing between them and the roof. Nelson laid down suppressive fire as King ran up the remaining steps. He smashed into the metal door with a flurry of blows, creating an opening large enough to squeeze through.
You first,
he said, turning to Nelson.
No, Blake, you go.
The Lazarus agent didn't need to be told twice. The hole was super small, so Blake had to work for it to squeeze through. Nelson grabbed King by the neck and gave him a fast kiss on the lips, then shimmied through the hole. King wasn't a man given to sentimental moments, but Nelson's kiss jolted him with a surge of adrenaline. His gaze turned back to the horde, their rabid hunger driving them up the stairs. His rifle became an extension of his arm as he sprayed the tainted with bullets.
That's for Miguel.
King popped his magazine and slammed his last one into his M4 carbine. There were so goddamn many of them. No way he was going to survive this. Hopefully, Nelson and Blake would have time to get away.
Come on, King,
he said. Nelson, face smudged with grime and sweat, waved for him to come through the hole. No way he was going to make it in time. The tainted were climbing over their dead buddies to get to them and were almost on him, but he didn't want to die here. Not like this. King fired another burst of bullets, tossed his rifle through the hole, and tried squeezing through. Blake and Nelson tugged at him from the other side of the hole, their combined strength finally managing to pull him through. Heart racing, King scrambled to his feet.
That door's not going to hold.
Nelson plucked 2 grenades from her belt and passed one each to King and Blake.
Set them for 60 seconds.
She knelt down and positioned her 2 grenades on the left side of the door. King and Blake followed her lead and set theirs on the right side. All 3 of them backed away and aimed their rifles at the door. King couldn't shake the chilling sense of inevitability. They were cornered, left with nothing but a 3-story jump, the nearest building too far to jump over to. No mystery cyberpunk dude was going to save them. This was it, their final line of defense. The tainted crashed against the door, the metal groaning under the onslaught. When the door finally gave way, Nelson, Blake, and King started firing, tearing holes into the tainted as they fell over themselves to get out the door. Blake's gun clicked empty, her face grim. "I'm out of ammo,"
Get behind us,
shouted Nelson. Before Blake could comply, the world exploded in a fiery cacophony, the grenades detonating and ripping through the tainted. The force of the blast slammed King against the far wall, the roar of the explosion deafening. Game over. King woke with a start, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He was strapped to a chair with Garrison and a smirking Wilson standing beside him.
Everything's all right.
Garrison said in her warm psychologist voice. Her patient smile was fake, just like her.
Everyone is okay.
She stepped from in front of him so he could see Miguel, Nelson, Blake, and Hayes were being unstrapped from their chairs. Relief flooded King. He thought he had lost Miguel for good. Man, this simulation was far too real. King stretched his arms and stood.
What's with the zombie routine? The Tainted don't eat people.
Creative license, Howie. Bad news, though. That was a very disappointing performance.
Wilson looked at Garrison for confirmation. She nodded.
You're not using your augmented limbs to peak efficiency. Even after that romantic kiss from Nelson.
Wilson's smirk grew wider as Nelson approached.
That was for motivation,
Nelson said.
not romance.
Wilson focused his attention on Nelson's boobs before responding.
Well, I could certainly use some motivation. Good,
Said Nelson, turning away.
Try your hand.
Chapter 6. King stepped out into the corridor. Most of HQ felt cold and impersonal, which totally summed up Lazarus Project, if you added ruthless to the picture. The scent of recycled air was heavy, tinged with the faintest trace of oil and metal, a reminder of the base's mechanical heart. King felt grateful, though. If it weren't for the fusion generators, they would have no power like the rest of the world. People moved about, faces drawn and lips pressed into thin lines, their eyes mirroring the weight of the upcoming mission. Maybe their last mission. King's heart raced when he noticed Maddox further down the corridor, all up in Leonardo's personal space, one beefy hand on the wall to block his escape. Maddox was like a rhinoceros made human, an oversized beast with the finesse of a sledgehammer. King increased his pace. Maddox noticed him and smirked.
One of your boyfriends? No.
King stopped 3 feet away from Maddox and raised his fist.
This is.
Before Maddox could blink, King hit him with a left jab, crushing Maddox's nose and sending the Lazarus agent stumbling backward. Leonardo gaped at the violence, pressing himself against the wall. Several agents gathered around to watch. King didn't care. Maddox was lucky that he pulled his punch. Otherwise, he would have more than a broken nose to worry about. Should have been a lot more blood, though. King didn't have enough time to think about it. Maddox had recovered and was now barreling toward him. King stepped to the side and let Maddox's momentum carry the brute past him, rewarding the bully with a thump on the head as he fell forward. Maddox regained his balance a lot faster than he should have. His next charge took King down, knocking the wind out of King. The guy was so heavy. Over 200 pounds, most of it muscle. Maddox knew how to use his weight to his advantage, quickly straddling King and pounding him with blow after blow. If it weren't for King's nanobots increasing his body's efficiency, he might be toast right now. Add his cybernetic limbs to the mix. King was a killing machine. He needed to get this big oaf off him and get back to his feet. Boxing and Muay Thai were his strengths, not wrestling.
Ouch!
Hissed Maddox. The fool had tried to land a solid blow to King's face. Too bad for him that King was covering his face with his cybernetic arms. Hitting titanium must hurt. King clocked Maddox in the head with an awkward left hook, which knocked the steam out of Maddox, so it was easy flipping him to the side. A couple of people started applauding when King straddled Maddox and started punishing him with body blows. King raised a right fist to slam into Maddox's face but stopped. Not only was Maddox's nose no longer bleeding, it wasn't broken anymore. The broken skin was also mending at an alarming rate. Maddox's bruises were disappearing. The sight left a sour taste in King's mouth. Maddox, blood spotting his ugly face, sneered at King.
Guess you're not the only one with those fancy nanobots anymore.
Apparently not. Maddox's rapid regeneration mirrored his own, a clear indicator of the nanite's work, meaning that Maddox not only had nanobots like him, Lazarus had managed to reverse engineer the nanite alien upgrade to heal so quickly, using him as the template, no doubt. This also meant that Lazarus was also probably at work trying to replicate his cybernetic limbs. Good luck with that, since Wilson himself admitted that Earth doesn't possess the material that his new limbs are made of. King punched Maddox in the kidneys, causing the big man to gasp. Now he would probably have to break a few bones to win this fight, which meant Maddox's team would have to replace him for the mission. If he was going out there today to possibly get his head blown off, he wanted Maddox to suffer the same fate. Knocking him unconscious would have to do. King drew back his right fist to make that happen and got a face full of white foam in his mouth. He and Maddox rolled away from each other, both trying to bat away the streams of freezing cold white foam. Damn it. Nelson was spraying them with a fire extinguisher. The foam wouldn't kill him, but it sure as hell stung his eyes. A few feet away from him, Maddox was coughing and wiping chemical suppressant from his face. Several agents giggled. Nelson wasn't one of them.
Save the fighting for the aliens. Now both of you get cleaned up. We leave in 20.
King still had the taste of nasty chemicals in his mouth when he returned to his quarters in fresh camos. Miguel wasn't there, but Leonardo certainly was. The ex-celebrity artist looked up from their tiny table when King walked in. King returned his toiletry bag to his locker, wondering briefly which locker Leonardo chose.
Why, King?
This was so not the conversation King wanted to have, but it was inevitable. As inevitable as he and Maddox getting into a fight. King pretended to be looking for something inside his locker.
Why what? Why did I interfere with you and Maddox?
You're not exactly a white knight.
Leonardo didn't sound accusing.
However, what I meant is, why did you and Nelson set me up? When you and Olivia didn't return my calls, and then my painting's value suddenly tanked, I realized that I'd been set up. I simply couldn't understand why you would want to destroy me.
King sighed and turned around. Time to face the music. Dark circles and stress lines marred Leonardo's usually handsome face. He was also a lot paler and thinner than he was when they hooked up months ago.
It wasn't personal, Leo. It was an assignment. Basically, you were collateral damage.
Leonardo stared at King with his dark, haunted eyes. So King apologized again. Sorry felt like a foreign language to him. He wasn't sure the last time he actually said sorry to anyone. Maybe he should tell Miguel that he's sorry for hiding his fling with Nelson and Leonardo. But then he would have to tell Miguel why he didn't tell him. He wasn't ready for that. Not now. Maybe not ever.
Collateral,
Leonardo chuckled, some of his bitterness slipping through.
Guess things worked out for the best. The aliens would have ended my career anyway. And if you hadn't known me, you might have left me to die in that hospital. Right?
King hoped that he would have freed Leonardo and the other captives anyway, but he couldn't say for sure.
What did Lazarus have you doing?
Leonardo shrugged.
Coding, a little hacking. It's what I used to do before I started selling in galleries.
King shut the door to his locker and headed for the door. Leonardo called after him.
Thank you, King.
A glimmer of confidence returned to Leonardo's voice.
Good luck with Nelson and Miguel.
King shut the door without another word. Chapter 7. Instead of beating himself up over all the people he screwed over or sulking about his amputated arms, King tried focusing on the invasion. The Helvari might be powerful enough to turn the planet into a glowing ember, but it would cost them Earth's resources. The blackout caused mass chaos, and the Tainted, well, pretty much brought down civilization. Wilson's theory about the aliens using humans as guinea pigs made sense, but it was way too clear-cut for King to buy into it. Guinea pigs for what? The roar of the hoverjet's guts chewed through King's focus, making it hard to concentrate. He had never flown inside a hoverjet before. It was like being crammed inside a gigantic armored plane that could fly up and down like a helicopter. 3 other squads were on their way to LA locations where Lazarus techs claimed there was portal activity. King looked around, keeping his face neutral. Miguel, Blake, Hayes, Maddox, and 4 other agents King knew only by sight filled out the small cabin. Wilson put Nelson in charge. Every now and then, King would catch Nelson looking his way, her lovely dark eyes unreadable. He wondered if she was thinking about the kiss she gave him in the simulation, regretting it maybe. On the opposite side of the cabin, Maddox took a break from chatting up Blake and winked at King. Asshole. If the universe had any sense of justice, Maddox would bite the bullet first. King grimaced at this train of thought, but couldn't stop himself. Lazarus's plan to infiltrate the Helvari portal was a one-way trip for all of them. To King, chasing portals felt as dumb as their last plan, which consisted of him getting abducted a second time. The memories of the Helvari techs trying to implant another parasite in him still sent shivers down his spine. Them messing with his head, tricking him into thinking he was stuck in a Lazarus simulation, rather than an alien ship. King gritted his teeth. He hated these bastards. He turned to Miguel sitting next to him. Maybe because of the bright sunlight in the cabin, but Miguel's eyes had hints of that Wilson creepy radiation blue color.
Ready for this?
King asked, trying to keep any sign of apprehension from his voice. Miguel looked at him, suspicion creasing his forehead.
Since when do you care what I think?
Always have, man. Always have.
A ghost of a smile appeared on Miguel's lips, quickly replaced by a hardened, battle-ready look. The hoverjet continued rumbling towards their destination. One of the pilots called out to them. They would be at the port of Los Angeles soon.
When did you learn how to use a sword?
King's eyes were on the scabbard nestled between Miguel's legs.
When you were missing. Wilson insisted that I learn how to use a sword. He even gave me a few lessons. The guy's good.
Now that was interesting. King always suspected that Wilson was a good fighter. But a swordmaster too? 30 minutes or so later, they were landing near the Vincent Thomas Bridge. Until a few hours ago, King had never heard of the bridge or the port, which didn't say much for his cultural awareness, given that this place was the busiest port in North America. Well, at least until the invasion. Nelson was out of her harness first.
No point sugarcoating this.
Nelson swept her gaze over all of them.
Most of us won't be coming back from this mission. Maddox is in charge, in case I don't make it to the portal.
Maddox grinned like a hyena. Looked like one too as far as King was concerned. Nelson continued.
Red team will carry the C4. Blue team will smoke anything and anyone in sight.
Miguel and King exchanged glances. King was red team. Neither of them was happy about it, but he did volunteer. If it were just Maddox and someone else besides Nelson, he wouldn't have.
Blue team,
Nelson said, raising her voice over the roar of the hoverjet's engines.
You will kill and, more importantly, distract the Helvari, while red team makes it its business to get through the portal.
Nelson hit a red button by the door and it swung open. Agents started piling out. King was impressed. Nelson really was turning out to be quite the leader. He found himself wondering if Miguel said goodbye to that doctor intern. Rifles pressed across their chests. King's squad hustled over to the port, caution in every step. The place was a graveyard of metal and old shipping containers. Dead cranes loomed over them as King and the others spread out. There was no activity or anyone else in sight, and the cynic in King doubted there would be, but he found a spot to hide anyway. It made sense for the Helvari to use this port as a staging area for delivering the parasites. According to their briefing, which of course lasted way too long, a wide variety of commodities passed through the LA port, including electronics, furniture, clothing, and perishable goods, particularly from China. The port was so big and important it had its own police station, pre-aliens. 2 hours and 3 energy bars later, King's wristband pulsed green twice, Nelson's signal that it was game time. King's gut tightened as he peered around his forklift hiding place. He spotted Blake on top of a metal container to his far right. She was a good shot, so sniper duty made sense for her. King's mouth dropped open as the air ripped open in a blinding flash between 2 stacks of grime-streaked metal containers. King felt his stomach do flips as the tear in reality grew wider, rounder. He didn't want to look at the widening portal, but he had to. Staring into the swirling, glowing hole was like staring at a window into another world. Only this world led to death. 4 Helvari, dressed in soulless blue and white uniforms, calmly exited the portal carrying metal crates close to their chests. A streak of violent purple shot up into the sky, shattering the morbid silence. Nelson's signal. From her perch on a container, Blake's rifle barked, taking out the lead Helvari technician. Red and blue teams sprang to life, pummeling the aliens with bullets. Yellow blood showered the dock as Nelson's voice sliced through the air, ordering red team to advance. King rushed forward, but a nagging doubt gnawed at his gut. This was too easy. A chorus of carnivorous howls erupted from the portal. King and the others stopped short, casting nervous glances at one another. Amets. King knew he could take them down, but for a heartbeat, he couldn't ignore the chills racing up his spine. Nelson shouted orders, but she was drowned out by the primal cries of the Amets bounding toward them from the portal. King shot a glance at Maddox, Hayes, and Miguel. Besides Nelson, they were the only Lazarus agents who came out of a fight with these beasts alive. The 4 men surged forward, while the others hesitated, probably afraid, and for good reason. A pack of 20 or more Amets sprang from the swirling portal with wolfish abandon, locking onto King and his squad with gleeful, predatory yellow eyes. Maddox kept charging while spraying the first wave of Amets with armor-piercing bullets. 2 Amets bought it in the throat, and another got clipped in the arm, but the creatures were too damn fast. One pounced on top of Maddox, its sharp claws slashing through his fatigues and flesh. King had his own problems. It took a fistful of bullets and too many seconds to kill just 3 Amets. He was hardly any closer to the portal, and now 2 Amets were bearing down on him. King didn't have enough time to get his rifle into position. Pivoting to make himself a smaller target, King managed to butt-stroke the Amet on his left, eliciting a yelp of pain from it. King spun back around in time to shoot its buddy in the gut. Hayes blasted the one King had just hit. They needed to move faster, before the Helvari closed the portal. It wasn't helping that these Amets were more resistant to bullets, and now didn't seem bothered by sunlight. Fortunately, the rest of the squad got over their initial shock and started blasting Amets too. The fight quickly devolved into a hurricane of claws, fangs, and bullets. While smashing an Amet with a spinning elbow strike, King saw some Amets take down 2 of his fellow agents. Another Amet came out of nowhere and slapped King with a nice gash across his face. Thanks to his titanium-reinforced bones, King had no problem snatching the offending Amet off the ground and flinging it into the Amets who were on top of the 2 downed soldiers. If their nanobots were anything like his, they would heal pretty quickly.
Move your butt, Hauser.
In all the crazy, Miguel stood out like a flare in the dark, his sword slashing smooth and fast like he was born into it. Amets dropped one by one, minus their heads or limbs. Sometimes Miguel just shot them. King ignored the smell of spent slugs and gouged flesh.
Cease fire,
Nelson shouted. King looked around like everyone else. The dock was littered with dead or dying Amets. King patted himself down with his free hand, knowing it was a stupid thing to do. The C4 pack in his vest wouldn't go off until he primed and activated it. To King's far left, he could see Maddox stumbling to his feet, the scars on his face already fading, just like his. The wounds he suffered from the Amets were now hardly an ache.
Red team, with me.
Nelson nodded at King and started for the glowing portal. Before they reached it, out stepped Wilson, modeling another wrinkle-free designer suit, his oily smile on maximum. Almost as disturbing, he carried a long 2-edged sword.
Hey, Howie. Nelson. Lazarus minions.
The Lazarus director looked down at the Helvari technicians splattered on the dock and shook his head. King noted that Nelson was the only one aiming her carbine rifle at him. Maddox spoke up first.
Is this another one of your stupid simulations?
King was wondering the same thing, and by the way everyone was staring at Wilson, he wasn't the only one.
Not a simulation. Meat.
Wilson shifted his eyes to the entire squad.
Think of it as a pass or die kind of test.
Damn. Nelson was right. Wilson was an alien. The enemy.
That's right, Howie. Though I prefer to think of myself as biracial, half human, half alien fiend. You should have listened to Nelson. Then again,
Wilson's eyes sparkled creepy blue.
Nelson's always been smarter than you. Nicer boobs, too. Almost as nice as Miguel's, wouldn't you say?
Wilson was playing mind games with him again, just like the Helvari did to him back on the ship. He wasn't sure if this was real or just happening in his mind. Nelson's bullet settled it.
Ouch!
Wilson clutched his bleeding sword arm.
Shoot me again, Nelson, and you'll never get me to sleep with you.
Nelson fired twice more. Wilson's face should have been mush, but he slid out of the way inhumanly fast.
Let's get him,
cried Hayes. Wilson held up a hand in surrender, but his left arm was no longer bleeding, meaning that he had taken the nanobot formula and was buying time.
Not buying time, Howie. I simply want to introduce you to my new friend.
A familiar figure strode out of the portal. Cyberpunk dude, hair moosed and looking smug.
This is Virgil, everybody. He's an augment, like Agent King here. Except, he knows how to fight. Plus, his body metamorphosizes and stuff into whatever he touches. Give it up, Wilson,
Nelson said.
Red Squad has you both surrounded. Oh no!
Wilson's eyes lit up in feigned panic.
What am I going to do? Oh, I know.
Wilson snapped his fingers and immediately King heard the pounding of feet. They all did. A sea of people, their eyes glazed with rage, poured onto the docks and rushed forward like a human wave. Men, women, and even kids. Some carried baseball bats. A lot of them had guns. They were tainted, and controlled by Wilson apparently. Maddox was the first to open fire on them, excitement in his dark eyes. King, however, couldn't shake a pang of regret. These guys were people once, but now they were puppets of the Helvari, just like them. This entire mission was a setup. No, Lazarus Project was one big trap. But why? Then again, it didn't really matter. Surviving this mess did. King turned to Miguel.
I'll handle Cyberpunk, dude. You take Wilson.
Miguel winked at King.
Let's take him down.
Cyberpunk dude, brown eyes cruel, sidestepped over to the shipping container to his right and palmed it with his hand. His face and hands instantly turned into the same pewter green as the metal container. Hell, even his moosed hair was metal. This fight was gonna hurt. Cyberpunk dude came at him fast. King stopped him with a push kick to the gut, instantly regretting it as a jolt of pain shot up through his leg. Kicking metal turned out not to be the smartest thing. Well, at least he slowed Cyberpunk dude down. Unfortunately, Cyberpunk dude wasn't dissuaded one bit. Palms open, Cyberpunk dude drew closer, keeping his hands moving, which meant that he was trying to distract King. His front leg shot up toward King's groin. King easily redirected Cyberpunk dude's leg, spinning him around so that his back was facing him. King clocked him in the head with a right hook, knocking the traitor even more off balance. The smack of metal against metal caused King to inadvertently take a quick peek to his far right. Miguel hammered away at Wilson with his sword. Overhead strike, a slice to the midriff, but Wilson easily blocked every blow. Nelson blasted Wilson with a couple of shots to the back before having to return her attention to the Tainted, overrunning their two squads.
Defensive circle.
Nelson shouted.
Move them all down.
King didn't have time to process the implications of Nelson's orders. He was too busy getting his ass kicked by Cyberpunk dude. King tried pivoting, but he was a second too slow. Cyberpunk dude slammed him in the thigh with a tie kick that caused King's left leg to buckle. A flurry of punches came next. King's arms automatically went up to protect his face. If it weren't for his cybernetic arms, his head would be mush right now. He was at a big disadvantage. The only thing super about him was his artificial arms. Sure, his nanobots healed him pretty quickly, and his titanium-enforced bones put him on the indestructible spectrum. But he was still made of flesh, and flesh didn't do well against steel. And Cyberpunk dude's entire body was now made up of steel.
Give it up, Miguel.
King heard Wilson say.
Otherwise, you're going to die, just like your bosom buddy King over there.
Wilson was always good at psychological torture. King just hadn't expected the Lazarus director to be such a good fighter. Miguel was pretty damn good too, especially judging by the blood-soaked gashes in Wilson's pretty suit. But Wilson was a better fighter, meaner. He speared Miguel's left tricep and followed with a spinning back kick. Miguel went flying. Apparently, Wilson boasted inhuman strength too. Cyberpunk dude grabbed King by the wrist and arm and shoved him face first into a nearby shipping container. King saw stars. Or maybe he just passed out for a few seconds. He barely had time to notice the blood pouring from his broken nose as Cyberpunk dude flipped him over his shoulder. He landed hard, but thanks to the alien upgrades to his nanobots, he was already healing. But not fast enough. Cyberpunk dude stomped a heavy foot on his back, crushing the wind out of him. The pain was so intense, King wasn't sure he could still move. He needed to get back up and fast, but King really wasn't sure he could take this guy.
Wilson was right,
Cyberpunk dude said, stomping on King's back a second time.
You really aren't performing at peak efficiency.
King clenched his teeth to keep from crying out. Peak efficiency? That's it. King forced himself to roll onto his back before Cyberpunk dude stomped him again. King backhanded Cyberpunk dude in the ankle and was rewarded with a gasp from his opponent. King shoved himself to his feet while Cyberpunk dude tried shaking out the pain in his right ankle. King threw a left hook at Cyberpunk dude's face, which he blocked easily, but it was a throwaway punch. King followed that up with a roundhouse kick to Cyberpunk dude's liver. Splinters of pain shot up King's leg, but he ignored it and sliced his elbow across Cyberpunk dude's face. Yeah, Cyberpunk dude might be all steel, but his cybernetic limbs were titanium and faster. Much faster. Cyberpunk dude tried blocking King's punches with his forearms. King didn't worry about that. He let muscle memory do all the work. He had the technique. He had the speed. Time to live up to his potential. A punch to the throat dropped Cyberpunk dude to his knees. An uppercut to the chin sent him flopping onto his back.
Bye-bye, Miguel.
King spun around as a red-faced Wilson lifted his arms for an overhead strike. Miguel was on his knees, swordless. Wilson's blade came chopping down at Miguel's neck. There was no way he could save him in time.
Stop.
Everything and everyone stopped at the sound of Trevor Hunt's voice. Everything except Wilson's blade. Chapter 8. The conference door swung open, distracting King from his dark thoughts. Trevor Hunt strode into the conference room with the same understated swagger that he managed back at the port. The Lazarus liaison dropped scores of Tainted with a single word. Stopped the Lazarus agents from shooting too. King suspected that Hunt's mind voodoo powers were a lot stronger than Wilson's. Wilson followed Hunt into the conference room. Cyberpunk dude took up the rear and closed the door behind them. King looked across the table at Miguel. If it weren't for Hunt, Miguel would be headless right now. As if sensing his thoughts, Miguel turned his attention to King. King was super glad that his buddy was still alive, but Miguel's eyes, they weren't radiation blue like Wilson and Hunt's, but they were getting closer. King felt his chest tighten. Nelson was right. His best buddy was an alien too. King doubted Miguel even knew it, though now he simply had to be wondering. Would Miguel turn into a sociopathic jerk like Wilson? Miguel frowned at King. Wilson plopped down at the head of the table. Trevor Hunt sat on his left, and Cyberpunk dude remained standing near the door. If the augment tried something stupid, King would make it his business to kill him this time. Garrison studied the three from the opposite end of the black marble conference table. Maddox spoke first, though King wasn't sure why the agent was invited.
"So you brought old metalhead here,"
he said, pointing to Cyberpunk dude. Wilson ignored Maddox and stared back at Garrison. Nelson was sitting directly opposite King. They didn't get a chance to discuss much since they arrived back at HQ except how neither of them trusted Wilson or Hunt.
"So,"
Garrison said,
"are you the real Helvari?"
Wilson's lips turned down in disgust, but it was Trevor Hunt who spoke up.
"We are most certainly not Helvari. We are Asmodeus."
"Asmodeus,"
Garrison repeated, her hazel eyes hard. As Wilson's second, she was now the de facto director, since Wilson was now clearly the enemy.
"You can refer to us as angels,"
said Wilson as he cast his gaze over the room's occupants.
"That's what your ancestors used to call us."
"We've been here,"
Hunt said,
"since biblical times. When we came to this planet, your ancestors saw us as angels."
King didn't buy it. These guys? Angels?
"Why did you come here?"
asked King. Hunt nodded at Wilson, again making King wonder who was really in charge. Hunt's nod was so subtle, King would have missed it had he not been watching the man. Wilson took a sip of water and smacked his lips before setting the glass back down.
"Fortunately, it's a short story. Once upon a time, in a galaxy far, far away."
"Wilson."
The reprimand in Hunt's voice was clear. Wilson glared back at Hunt, then shrugged, shaking his head.
"Some people don't respect the art of storytelling. Anyway, our forebears were at war with a species from another star system. They tried to take our planet by force. We didn't let them. We even managed to infect them with a lethal virus."
Hunt cut in.
"Unfortunately, they did us one better and rained down the bacteria that attacked the Asmodeus female chromosome, killing all of our females, and by default, destroying our species. What does that have to do with us?"
Nelson's eyes were hard. King didn't blame her. He felt the same way.
"Well,"
said Wilson, smiling.
"we had portal technology even back then."
Garrison finished the thought for him.
"So you came to our world and mated with human women?"
"Well, some of us did.
Wilson sneered at Hunt.
Others weren't as particular."
"What about Miguel?"
King asked before he could stop himself. Wilson's evil gaze shifted to Miguel for a moment.
"Miguel has no clue about his true nature. His power isn't supposed to manifest for another 15, 20 years.
"But you changed that, didn't you?"
Wilson didn't deny King's accusation. He simply grinned.
"You used me as a guinea pig."
Wilson's grin turned cruel.
You're all guinea pigs, Miguel. Metaphorically speaking. Since you haven't died yet, I'm guessing that nanobots won't harm the rest of us Asmodeus. Only make us stronger. I'm not some alien.
The urgency in Miguel's voice tugged at King's heart.
Next you'll be telling us you're my daddy. Nah.
Wilson shook his head.
Even if I was, with offspring like you, I would never admit it.
Maddox flicked open his switchblade and began cleaning his nails.
So what the hell you want from us?
Why all the training?
Nelson leaned forward.
All those simulations?
Wilson steepled his hand like a cheap Bond villain.
Training you.
To fight your war against the Helvari.
A hint of a smile played on Garrison's lips.
Am I right, Mr. Hunt?
Hunt served up what under normal circumstances would be a charming smile.
More of a surgical strike.
Garrison leaned in for the kill.
So this is about revenge? That's why you started Lazarus Project?
This is about survival, Agent Garrison.
Hunt paused for effect.
Earth's
Survival.
Where'd you get the spaceship from?
Asked Miguel. Hunt's snort was barely a whisper.
There is no ship, Miguel.
It's all one big simulation. But the portals are real. Always have been.
Maddox looked up from his pedicure.
That's how you plan to attack the Helvari?
Wilson nodded. Miguel spoke up again, his eyes intense.
If you got no ship, how did you bomb the planet with EMPs? Well,
said Wilson.
We may have hijacked one or a few dozen satellites.
Nelson jabbed a finger at Wilson.
You kill thousands of people for your little training sessions?
No, Nelson. You killed them.
Wilson's eyes scanned the table.
All of you did.
I simply set you loose and let human nature take its course.
Maddox chuckled and cocked his fingers at cyberpunk dude.
At least we're not traitors like that guy.
I like playing with winners.
Cyberpunk dude aimed his smirk at Maddox.
Besides, you killed a whole lot more people than I ever have, and you clearly enjoy killing those poor Tainted. No, Wilson.
The disgust in Garrison's eyes was clear.
You and the rest of the Asmodeus already use us for baby factories. We're not fighting your war for you.
King expected Wilson to shoot back, but it was Hunt who spoke up.
It's Earth's war, Agent Garrison. The Helvari's homeworld is dead, and they need a new home.
Hunt let that thought settle in before continuing.
They've been en route to Earth for hundreds of years. They're due to arrive
Hunt pretended to check his watch.
in the next month or so, give or take a week.
And they're not bringing cookies,
Added Wilson. It was possible they were lying. Very possible. But if they weren't... King swiveled his chair to better face Wilson.
You want to portal into their ship and kill them.
Guilty.
Wilson looked totally pleased with himself.
What do we get out of this?
Nelson's question surprised King.
I've given you nanobots. You and your fellow agents are going to live as long as me and my fellow Asmodeus.
Wilson's gaze drifted to Miguel.
Maybe longer.
King slammed his fist on the table, startling everyone. Everyone but Wilson and Hunt. The nerve of this guy. King wanted to smack that smirk off his face.
You sliced off my arms.
It was a gift, Howie.
I'm not some lab rat.
No, you're a weapon. Not much else to you, I'm afraid. Just ask your buddy. And Nelson. Besides, we did a lot worse to some of the other abductees. You destroyed Earth,
Garrison said, eyes locking on Wilson and Hunt. Hunt met Garrison's glare with a sleek, evil grin.
Not destroyed, Agent Garrison. Set it back a few decades, perhaps. But not Lazarus Project, or you. As Lazarus' new director, you get to shape this lost planet into something better. Wouldn't you like that, Agent Garrison?
No doubt about it. These guys could read minds. King was certain of it.
We're not mind readers, Howie. So how do you know what we're thinking?
Asked Miguel, his jaw tight.
And how do you control the Tainted?
Wilson looked at Nelson for several long seconds. King half wondered if he would answer her question.
The Asmodeus are empaths. We read emotions.
Wilson tapped the side of his head.
We can also control parasites remotely, too.
Maddox leaned back in his chair and let out a whoop.
Convenient. So, how do we know you're not trying to conquer the planet?
I already told you, meat. Our race is effectively extinct. We can only procreate only so much. Our numbers will never be large enough to take over Earth.
Hunt cleared his throat. All eyes went to him as he spoke.
14 Lazarus cells have already agreed to our proposal. I'll need to confirm that,
Garrison said. Hunt nodded like he was a goddamn king. But Garrison didn't treat him like one as she continued.
You will stop shipping and implanting parasites, effective immediately.
Wilson opened his mouth to speak, but Garrison held up her hand.
You'll also hand over your portal technology.
Wilson glared at Garrison, then glanced at Hunt.
We'll give you access. No.
Garrison shook her head, smiling.
You want us to fight your war for you. You give us the specs. We could force you.
Hunt let the threat hang in the air.
He's bluffing,
King said, meeting Hunt's evil gaze.
As your simulations and training have so abundantly made clear, volunteers are much more effective than slaves.
Hunt and Wilson looked at one another. Wilson shrugged.
Okay, Howie, we have a deal.
Nelson slapped her hands on the table and yelled at Garrison.
We can't trust them. We can leave Miguel behind as collateral if you like. You're not leaving me behind.
Hunt rose from the table with a flourish. Then it settled. Garrison rose too, as did Maddox.
I'll have to put it to a vote. You do that.
Hunt shifted his icy gaze to Nelson, then King. He winked at King, then left the conference room. Garrison, Maddox, and cyberpunk dude followed him, which left the rest of them with Wilson, who was smiling, like a used car salesman who had just unloaded his last lemon.
Guess you were right, Howie. I am the villain after all.
King nodded, thinking about his missing arms.
Guess that makes me the hero then.
Wilson's predatory blue eyes narrowed. After a few tense moments, Wilson chuckled to himself, rose, and turned toward the door. King was tempted to jump him and ram his fist into the liar's big mouth. Instead, King leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Nelson and Miguel were staring at him. Well, at least all three of them were still alive.
What do we do now?
Asked Miguel. Nelson shook her head.
Destroy the Helvari, I guess. If we can.
King cracked his knuckles, but they made no sound.
And destroy Wilson and the Asmodeus when we get the chance. If you enjoyed Howard King, his story continues in the ebook space opera series, Shatterstar Wraith. Click the link in the first pinned comment for a special discount on the first 3 books in the series.